Hi everyone. So setting up Node Express backend applications could be a lot of hassle at times, and it is really a time-taking process. And when you also want some additional functionalities in your application, such as logging, then setting that up can add up the bootstrapping time of your applications. And in today's video, we'll be basically exploring a generator that will get you going in like 30 seconds or something with just one command. So let's go ahead and explore that. So this is the generator that we'll be exploring today in today's video. Kudos to the contributors and creators of this particular generator. I personally love this backend template, and this has so many things enabled by default that you're going to love it. So let's go ahead and see how we can use this. So to begin with, you're supposed to install their generator into your system globally. So you can do that by running this particular command in a terminal. Let's go ahead and quickly do that. I will run this command. So this will basically install their generator into our system globally, and we can basically use it anywhere in our system to generate backend templates directly. And you can basically use this particular command to generate new applications or new projects. Now there are two configurations that are available. So you can either use TypeScript or you can use JavaScript. So whichever you prefer, you can go ahead and use that particular template. I think the generator for both of these is same. So for TypeScript, you are supposed to write express no stress TypeScript, and for JavaScript version, you're supposed to write express no stress. So you can run any of the two commands to either create a TypeScript Node.js Express backend app project or a JavaScript project. And this particular thing is basically the name of your project. Other than this, there are a few other configurations that you can do. So the app name parameter is basically the name of your project. You can also pass in -- yarn to basically use yarn as your package manager instead of npm, and you can pass in -- docker option as well to install docker file and perform all of those configurations. So this is the available template. So let's see if it is installed. So the generator is installed, and now we can simply go ahead and use this particular command to generate a new project. So let's go ahead and call our project YouTube, and this will prompt me with some questions. So let's go ahead and answer these questions. So first of all, it is asking me for an app description. So let's write a demo description. This is for YouTube tutorial. And now it is asking me what should be the default API route. So I am fine with API/v1. The default version is also okay with me. Now, which OpenAPI spec version do I want to use? I personally prefer using OpenAPI 3. So let's go ahead with that. And next up, it is asking me which linter I want to use. So Airbnb linting is like very famous in the development world, and a lot of companies use Airbnb's configuration as their base configuration to lint their code. But for now, we'll just go ahead with prettier, and then it will create all the necessary files that are required to set up the project. And while it is doing this, let's go ahead and explore the repository. So it says that it creates awesome Express applications with the best breed tech, including es.next via babel.js and structured logging with Pinot. So they have logging by default enabled in their project, in their Bootstrap repository, and API validation is also by default enabled, and documentation as well. So this particular thing is something that I really like. What they mean by API validation is, so for every route that you create in their bootstrapped application, you'll basically have to define what all arguments or what all parameters that particular route can accept in the body or in the URL. And if that particular route is called from some other application with invalid parameters or invalid body data, then they'll basically throw an error directly without even your app having to handle that entire thing. So this is what they mean by API validation. They'll basically take care of whether the request is being called, whether the request that is coming to your application is a valid request or not, as per what you have defined for that particular request. And also they have like a very interactive documentation by default enabled, so you can go ahead and test your application through that documentation, call each of your routes. And also for people who are not really into backend development and you want to provide them with the documentation of your backend code base, you can basically just provide them with this particular URL of the documentation directly, and they can go ahead and explore all the available routes, etc. So that is really cool. So we'll go ahead and explore all of that. So yeah, the application is created. Let's quickly go into that particular folder and open this inside VS Code. So yeah, it is now open. For starters, the project structure can look like very intimidating because there are like a lot of files, and there is this server folder. Inside server there is this common folder, and inside API there are 3 other separate folders. So initially this could be very intimidating for a lot of new developers, but we'll go ahead, slowly break down everything and understand what each of these files and folders basically mean. So let's begin with package.json. There are multiple scripts and packages that are by default created and installed. So there are a lot of eslint related configuration packages. There are Babel related. So if you don't know what Babel is basically a transpiler. So you write all sort of modern JavaScript syntaxes in your code, but browsers don't really understand all of that. So what Babel does is it basically transpiles your JavaScript into browser understandable or your specific node understandable JavaScript code. So Babel basically does that for you. And let's go ahead and see what all other packages they have installed in their system in this particular bootstrapped application. So they also have testing enabled by default, so they're using Mocha and Supertest for testing of JavaScript application. And they have prettier installed. This is basically a logging package. This will basically help us in logging different API responses or error messages throughout our application. And other than that, what all things they have installed, they have body parser and cookie parser, etc. installed by default. They have .env set up by default. So, and obviously like the open API validator, they also have that installed by default. And when we come to the script section, there are like a ton of scripts that they have written by default. Let's see what all these are being used for. So when you're in the development mode and you don't want to manually restart your server again and again, and you just want it to refresh on its own whenever you make any changes, you're supposed to run the npm run dev command. And every time you make a change to your application, this particular your application will basically restart, because they're using nodemon for doing that. I'm sure you must be aware of what nodemon is, because almost every developer who starts their backend development journey, they are introduced to this particular package at the very start. Then they also have test command to basically test out your entire application. If you write test in your backend application, then you can simply run this particular command to test everything out. Then these are 2 pretty cool commands that I really like. And like usually developers don't really set up linting and formatting by default in their applications, but when your code base grows and there are multiple people working on the same project, it is really important to set up like linting and formatting rules throughout your code base. So they have this eslint.rc.json file, wherein you can basically configure a lot of things, like whether you prefer single quotes or you prefer trailing commas, how much print width do you want, and there are like a lot of other configurations that you can do. You can basically visit the official docs of Prettier and eslint to figure out what all configurations you can do to basically set some standard rules and regulations within your code base. So yeah, these 2 commands that you are seeing in package.json, lint and linkfix, are basically used in that. So if I want to quickly show you a demo of these 2 commands, let's open one of the files. I'll explain you what these files mean, but let's quickly see a demo of that linting. So as you can see, I created some extra relevant space, and I'll quickly save this file. Now when I run the npm run lint command, it will basically show me that there is formatting issue in this particular file at this particular line number, and it is telling me to delete all these extra enters that I have pressed. So if I don't want to do this manually, I can simply run their fix command. So I can simply do npm run lint :fix, and once I do that, you will see that those extra spaces that I created and enters that I pressed, all of them are deleted, and my code is back to being formatted properly again. So you can basically set up something called as pre-commit hook in your application and run this every time someone tries to commit code to your repository. So this could like enforce really good code practices in your application. Let's see what else was available in the package.json. And when you're deploying your application to when you're ready to deploy your application to a particular server or instance, then you can run the compile command. This will basically build your entire project, and basically Babel will do its magic, transpile all the code and output everything in a separate directory, and you can basically push that particular directory to some instance and use the start command to run your server from that particular directory. So let's quickly see that in action as well. I can run npm run compile, and focus over here, it will basically create a dist directory, and inside this dist directory you will see that Babel has done its magic, and there is like a transpiled JavaScript code available over here. And now I can simply run the start command to basically run my server from the dist directory. So in production you should ideally do this, and when you're locally running your server, you should basically use the def command to run your server, because in development mode you will be making a lot of changes and you would want restarts in your server, so you should ideally prefer running the def command. Now let's move on and see what the folder structure is like and what all these individual folders and directories basically represent. So if we go through over the files, we have the eslint .rc.json file, wherein I told you before that you can write a lot of configurations for enforcing good coding practices in your project. Then you have the git ignore file, wherein you can mention all the files and folders that you want Git to ignore and not upload to GitHub. Then we have our usual package.json and package log file, readme file. Nodemon rc.json file is basically like a configuration for Nodemon to watch this particular directory or the n file for any changes, and if there are any changes, then basically restart the server. And other than that, we have the n file for defining all the environment variables. Other than that, Babel RC configuration. So this is like a base configuration for Babel. You can modify this as per your requirements once you like go through the documentation and you figure out there's something new that you can implement. So you can use the Babel RC file. Then there's the test directory, wherein you can basically write tests for your different routes and controllers, etc. And then there comes the main directory, server. So let's go ahead and explore what is available in this particular directory. So when you go to this particular file, routes.js, all your routes, all your default routes will be available in this particular directory. So as you can see, there's one router that has already been created by the creators to basically show how the application works and how the entire generator works. So this route is basically API/v1/examples, and this particular route has multiple sub routes. So basically you can perform post, get, and get a particular ID request on this particular route. So they have created a default router, and inside this router there are multiple routes that have been created. So that is one. And other than that, in the index.js file, this is the main file, the entry point of the entire application. Inside this, they are basically doing the entire configuration of setting up a server and basically passing down all the available routes of the application and listening to a specific port. We'll go ahead and see what this server and basically this server instance is doing inside this particular file. So this is about index.js and route file. Now let's go ahead and explore the common folder. So inside the common folder, there are a few things. So the very first thing is api.yaml file. So in this particular file, you basically write description about your routes. So for example, they've created 2-3 default routes for us. So the default route is basically /example, and then there are multiple multiple methods that you can hit this particular route with. So you can call get you can basically make a get call to /example. You can basically make a post call to /example, and you can also make to get a particular ID object, you can basically make a /example/ID request, get request. So these are basically the different routes that are available, and inside these you can basically define how this particular route is supposed to behave, what will be the response in case of 200, what will be the response in case of 400, and if it is a post route, then what all sort of variables or arguments it is accepting in the body. You can basically define all of that in the YAML file, and using this particular YAML file, it will generate a documentation for your entire application. So we'll go ahead and see this when we get to coding one route. And other than that, there's the .env configuration done over here, and they're also using Pinot for logging throughout the entire application. So this is the configuration for Pinot. There are different modes of logging available inside Pinot. You can go ahead and visit the package documentation on npm, and you can update the environment file for any different logging level. So yeah, you can make those changes. It is very customizable and stuff. This is the main file, server.js. Everything regarding setting up the entire server happens in this particular file. So they're basically importing a lot of files and packages, and then they have set up the entire server. And they're basically using class-based code throughout the Bootstrap project, and the services and controllers are also written in that particular format. So let's go ahead and see what is happening over here. So they're using body parser, cookie parser, etc. And then for providing documentation, they also have they've also done path normalization, and all the HTML file that is available inside the public directory that is basically responsible for creating the API documentation is being set up inside the server. So is inside this particular file. So you don't really need to take care of any of this setup. This is already being handled for you. And then there's API validation being enabled over here. So they'll basically verify if the endpoint that you're trying to hit and the endpoint that you're trying to hit is being hit with proper body data or not, or whether you're passing the right set of arguments in the URL or not. So basically this API validation will take care of all of that process. And then they're basically listening on a specific port. You can change that port from the environment file, and then they're doing a simple log when the server starts running. So this is pretty much it inside the server.js file. I completely understand that this looks very intimidating and very overwhelming at first, but if you don't really need to understand all of this stuff, the entire setup process, because that is already being done for you, and you can basically go ahead and start using the application and pass in extra configurations that you want your application to have. So this is about the server file. Now let's quickly jump into the API folder. Inside the API folder, you'll see that there are 3 subfolders: controllers, middlewares, and services. Now every request that you make in your application, so for example, if there's a route /example, it will first come to the router. It will see that it is that the client is basically trying to hit the /example route, and once it figures out which route you're trying to hit, it will redirect that it will basically call the specific controller associated to that particular route. So let's say example controller is the name of the controller that is associated to /example route, and once it gets to the controller, it will pass down all the logical handling stuff to the service that is associated to that particular controller. So the reason why they have this sort of folder structure, I have written a line in my notes. So controllers are basically used for sanitization of inputs, and services are used for handling the core logic for a particular route. So what I mean by this is, let's take an example. Let's say you have a sign-in route, and in a sign-in route, you'll obviously be passed with email and password from the client end, or if you're trying to hit it from Postman, then you'll basically be passing email and password in the body. Now the controller is basically responsible to sanitize the body data to see if the email is a valid email or not, if the password is an empty string or not. And when it sanitizes all those inputs, it will basically pass that body data to the service, and the service will take care of all the heavy stuff and basically handle all the core logic. And what I mean by core logic is it will go and check in the database that that particular email even exists or not, and if it exists, if the password is correct or not, it will basically do all the hashing and stuff and check if the password saved in the database is a valid password or not, and all the heavy stuff, heavy handling stuff will be taken care by the service itself. And once the service is sure about whether the user is a true user or not, it will return the response to the controller, and then the controller will be responsible for sending the response back to the client. So the controller is only used for sanitization of inputs and other small stuff, but your services are the core part that handle the core logic of your application. So that is the ideology that this particular Bootstrap project follows, and that is why you see this sort of folder structure. So let's go ahead and see what all files and folders they have in this particular directory. So they've created a default middleware for us, and I would ask you to let this be, because this will take care of this will basically handle all sorts of errors throughout your application. So in any of your routes or in any of your services, you're basically supposed to throw error, and this middleware will basically take care of throwing that error properly to your client. So this particular middleware is really good to handle all sorts of errors. We'll see this in working. So I think a better way to approach this would be to write one of our own routes. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's quickly go ahead and create 2 sample routes to better understand how you're supposed to create new routes in this template. So to start with, I've created a new directory called user, and I have also created a file inside services directory called user.service.js, and this is like a completely empty file for now. Let me quickly rename this to user service. So yeah, this is like a completely empty file for now. To create this particular file, you can simply copy paste this particular file and remove all of this stuff and change the name of the service. So I've basically done that and created this user service file. Similarly, I've copy pasted this examples folder to create this other folder, and inside this as well I have an empty controller and an empty routes.js file. I've commented all the routes for now because we haven't created any routes. So let's go ahead and create 2 simple routes. One of these will return user data, so it will be a get route, and the other one will basically take the username as a parameter and will get data from the database and return the GitHub URL of that particular user. To mimic the database, I have simply created this utils directory, and inside this utils directory I have created a sample database for me. So there's this file called data.js, and inside this we simply have an object that is a key that has the key of the user, and the value that is associated to that particular key is basically their GitHub URL. So let's go ahead and quickly code these 2 routes. So I'll go to the routes.js file, and what I want is I want 2 routes. One of them will be a / route, and for that I'll call the function get all users, and one of them will be a post route, and for that I'll call get user GitHub details. So I'll create these 2 routes, and since currently these 2 functions inside the controller don't exist, we are getting error. So let's quickly go ahead and basically create these routes. Also, my formatter is set up to changing single quotes to double quote, but inside the configuration we have single quotes true. So that is why every time we format we'll basically get errors. So I'll change that over here. Yeah, so now you can see that it is not throwing any errors anymore. So let's go ahead and create these 2 functions inside our controller. So usually you'll be fetching this data from basically some database or some other place. So these would be like async functions. I have created two async functions, more like GitHub Copilot created two functions for me. So I'll quickly use that because that will help us with the time, and I'll explain the process. So I created two functions inside the controller. One of the function is called get user GitHub details, which will basically return the GitHub details of that specific user, and the other function is called get all users, which will basically return all the user data. Now in this particular function, you'll probably get the name of the user inside the body. And as I said earlier, controllers are responsible for sanitization of input. So what you can do over here is you can extract the username from the request body and check and do something like that. If username is not there, you can throw an error called username is required or something like that. So your controller will basically take care of sanitizing the input or checking if the input is as per requirements or not. And once it is done doing that, it will pass that username to your service, and your service will basically take care of fetching data from your database and changing it or manipulating it or making or basically removing extra data and only keeping the data that is required for sending back to the user. And then it will return the response to back to the controller, and the controller will be responsible for sending that data back to the client. So this is how things work. And inside the get all users function, we won't really be getting any sort of data in the body. We are basically going to fetch all the users and going to return them directly to the client. So there is no sanitization of input being done over here. The request is directly passed on to the service, and the service will take care of fetching all the users and return all the users to the controller, and the controller will then return all those users to the client. So this is sort of the code that we will be writing inside the controller.js file. Now similarly, let's go ahead and write code inside the user service. Let's see if GitHub Copilot can suggest that. Yeah, it did. So actually it did not. So let's go ahead and write that code on our own. Yeah, so let's remove this. For get all users, I would simply import the user data util file that I've created, and I'll simply return this user data object directly to the controller, because that is the JSON data and we want to return data of all the users. So this data will be passed back to the controller and inside this users variable, and will directly return this data back to the client. So this is one route, and for the other route we are getting the username, and we obviously want to extract the data of that particular user. So yeah, in ideal case you would be doing something like that. You'll basically be calling your database and finding that particular user, but for now I am going to mimic this. So we'll basically write something like user data, and we'll extract that data from user for that particular user using like basically extract the data of that particular user using the username that we received from the controller. And now we'll return this data back to the controller. So yeah, it got imported 2 times, so we'll remove this. And ideally you should wrap all of this inside a try catch, because this might include database calls, etc., and any of that can fail. And in case that fails, what you would want to do is you would want to do something like this. So since we have our logger set up, you would do something like this. You will log the error. So this error function takes in 2 arguments. This is not visible over here, but you can log the error and also basically log some sort of text to identify where this error was thrown. So we can write some meaningful text like error while getting all users. Now whenever you see this particular statement in your logs, you will be able to figure out that this error was thrown inside this particular service. So you should ideally do something like this. And let's also wrap this inside a try catch over here. So you can move these 2 lines over here, and let's write a catch block over here as well. Error while getting user details, user GitHub details would be a better error message. So let's go ahead and do that. Yeah, so you're doing basically this, and we're, as you can see, like we are simply throwing back the error directly from these files. And the reason why we are doing this is because we have this middleware set up by default, any error that gets thrown will essentially be eventually be passed to this particular error handler, and this will take care of sending the error back to the client. So we don't really need to take care of that. So let me remove this extra file, and now we have our services ready. Let's go ahead and check the controllers one. Let's see if the function names are right or not. So yeah, GitHub user details and get all users. Yeah, so these are also right, and ideally we should also wrap these inside try catch. Why am I wrapping these inside separate try catch? So this way you can have different messages for your services and for your controllers. So you can do something like user service and then this particular message, and same way you can also write user service here as well and then this particular message. So suppose your data got passed on successfully from the controller to the service, but the fetching was there was an error while fetching the data, and this error got logged. So you'll know exactly in which particular file that error was caused, and it was not inside the controller but inside the services file. So if you wrap these inside separate try catch blocks and throw different errors, you'll basically be able to understand from which part of your application the error was thrown, and this will basically help you with the debugging process a lot. So let's quickly go ahead and write a meaningful message here as well. We don't want to do this, we would rather log and user controller, and let's quickly import this here as well. Now to basically pass down the error to our middleware that was by default available to us, we would require the next function of Express. So by default we get that by inside the controller. So in Express you get 3 parameters inside any of your controllers: request, response, and the next function. And this next function is basically responsible for passing down command of operations to the next middleware or the next thing in the line. So we'll pass down this error to this. Now why exactly are we doing this? We are doing this because this error handler, if you see where this is being used inside our project, you'll see in the server.js files, after we are done registering the routes, this is being used as a middleware. So for any route, this will be called after the route controller is called. So what we want to do is, in case the API call or whatever logic we write over here, in case the database fetching or everything is successfully done over here, we want to return the user successfully. But if there is an error, we want to move the chain of command to the middleware, the error handler middleware. So that is why we are using the next function of Express over here. We'll basically call the error handler middleware using this next function and pass down the error details to that particular error handler. And what this will do is this will take care of throwing that error back to the client, and we wouldn't have to take care of that. So you can basically do that over here as well and write the error, basically write the catch block in this particular function as well. So this is how you handle errors in this particular template. And now since we are done with writing 2 controllers, let's quickly register these as routes. So we have created the router over here, but we also need to register this inside route.js file. So let's quickly go ahead and create a route for this. Let's comment this one and let's comment this. Let's call this API/v1/user. So if you hit /API/v1/user as a get route, then you'll basically be returned with all the user data. And if you hit it like a post route with the username of the user, then you'll basically be returned with the GitHub data of that particular user. And let's import our router. So let me change this only. Let's call this user router, and we want this from user controller and router.js file. I am not sure why it is not showing me this as a suggestion. Let us write this and check. Let me quickly try again if it is the right address. Yeah, it is the right address. Earlier it was not showing it as suggestion. So yeah, we have quickly set up the routing as well. Now if you check localhost :3000, if you check localhost :3000, you'll see that we don't have user routes registered over here as of now, because we haven't really written a documentation for these new routes. So let's go ahead and do that as well. We can go to the common directory, and inside this we have the api.yaml file. Now these new routes are basically responsible for handling user related stuff. So we can give these type of routes a separate category, and let's call that category called let's call this category user, and the description for this particular category would be user related endpoints. So we can basically tag all our user related endpoints with the user tag, and they'll come under a separate category. So let's quickly go ahead and copy paste this itself, and or rather let's change this itself to see our user routes. So one of the route is /user, and we have a get endpoint for it, and the tag should be user. And what this does is it fetches all user data, and in case of 200 it returns the data of all users. And let's quickly define a schema of how the user data will look like. So let's rename this as user, and let's find the example schema. So below over here they have schema defined over here. So what sort of data will be returned back to the user? So the data will be an object, and that object will have keys of type name, and the value would be basically their GitHub URLs. So we can write a simple GitHub URL over here, //github.com/kunaljain0212, and let's call this name, or let's call that name itself, because that would be more generic. So yeah, and let's rename this to user. So this sort of schema would be returned when the response is 200, and we don't want to define 400 and 500 for now. You can do that when you are building your own application. And in case of post route, we will fetch the GitHub user details of a specific user. So let's write that, fetch GitHub user details of a specific user, and the request body would basically be user body. And let's go ahead and write user body down there, and let's show how it will look like. So user body, and what we'll require in this is we'll require a property called username. So if you remember the route that we created, or the controller that we created, we are basically expecting a property called username inside the request body. So we are supposed to write that same name over here as well. So it should be called username, and this particular thing will basically have a property called username, and it will be a string. So let's go ahead and do that. And inside this object, so what this is basically saying is that the type of the user body would be an object, and inside this object there will be a property called username, and that property is required. And how will the username property look like? So the username property will basically be of type string, and let's give an example string over here, and that string would be my name, and that is Kunal. So let's quickly check in the data.json. Yeah, it is in small case, so yeah, no issues with that. And I think this should be it. This should pretty much solve the entire thing. And we also don't want to define the 400 and 500 routes for this. So let's remove this, and let's say we'll return the same user response that we're returning in get case, although it won't be same, but let's write that, and return GitHub user details. Let's quickly save this and see if we can see our routes. It says on line number 131 we have an error. So let's go ahead and see what the error is on line number 131. Is that expected end of stream with a double quoted scalar? Right, so we missed a double quote over here, which is why it was creating an issue. Let's quickly reload this. And now you'll see that we have a separate category of endpoints called user endpoints, and this category has two routes. One of them is a get route and the other one is a post route. And inside the get route we can see that it returns the data of all users in case of 200, and the data is something like this. And in case of post route, we are supposed to submit a body of something like this, wherein the username of the user is supposed to be submitted, and in response we get this sort of response. And this request body is required, so that is there. Let's quickly test this out. So let's try out the get route first, and if we execute it, example does not exist. So let's see if we missed anything in the documentation with the get route. So this is the get route, and one thing, I think we register the route. Yeah, we registered the route. Yeah, so I figured out the issue. The issue was that we commented out the example router from this particular file. So basically this particular route doesn't even exist, but when it is trying to read this file, this particular route wasn't commented out, and it was trying to figure out if this route is available or not. So I commented this route for the documentation of this particular route from this file as well, and now everything is working properly. So if I reload the application and try to hit the user endpoint and execute this, you can see that our response is being returned properly. So you can see that the data is being returned properly, and we can test out our application directly from the documentation itself. Let's go ahead and test out the post route as well. And inside the username, I want to give Kunal itself, because that is the only username that exists in the database. And if I execute this, cannot access user data before initialization, that is probably some sort of a code error from our end. Let's see the logs, and as you can see, this is what I was talking about. With these sort of logs, you can figure out which file this issue is occurring from. So you can see the error got logged, and the error is from user controller file. So let's go ahead and see what did we mess up inside this particular file. So we are basically calling this file, and inside this particular file we are extracting the username of the user and then calling it, and cannot access user data. This is occurring inside services. So user data, we use the same naming convention over here. So yeah, there was another, this is what I was thinking, that how is it possible that the error occurred in this particular file and this catch block did not get called. So the logs were done for this as well. So if we go to the very start of the log, the actual error occurred inside user service file. So inside this particular file, you can see that we are we are basically extracting out the user details and storing it inside the same variable. So let's change the name. Let's change it to user, and now let's test it out again. So let me reload this and try it out again. And if we execute this now, you'll see that the GitHub URL of that particular user is being returned successfully. So this is how the entire boilerplate in this template works. This is how you define controllers, then you define services for those specific controllers and define those inside routes. And you also got to see like a live example of how error logging inside this work, and how you can use the logs that you are writing to figure out in exactly which file the error occurred from. So yeah, this is the benefit of this particular template. This template makes your entire code very explicit and tells you exactly what file or what part of your code does a particular thing. And also, while error logging, you can figure out which file was the main occurrence of that particular error. So yeah, this is like a very good template. You should try writing one or two routes in this particular template, and once you're done or familiar with writing one or two routes in this particular template, it will be like a very easy job to write your entire application in this particular template. And the only thing that is intimidating in this whole template is the separation of concerns. So you have separate services files, controllers and routes, and then there's other packages and stuff that is already installed. You don't need to worry about it. All of that has already been set up for you. So you only need to focus on writing services, controllers and routes. I hope you enjoyed the video and got to learn a lot. It was like a actual developer experience because we encountered errors and we tried to resolve them right in the video itself. And errors can happen to like any of the developers out there. Nobody's perfect. So like I don't mind solving errors right in the video. I hope you appreciate that, and see you in the next one. Do let me know what you think about this entire template and if you will be using it inside your in your future projects or not. And let me know if you have any specific requests for any specific videos on certain topics, and I'll make sure to cover those. Thank you for watching.